The Earth goes through periodic cooling periods known as ice ages, with the last ice age ending a few tens of thousands of years ago. Today, we're resting comfortably in the middle of a mild climate period, which means moderate winters in most places around the world and year-long sunshine in California. But today, we're also capable of changing the environment artificially and are already doing so via uncontrolled release of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which are warming the planet. But with thousands of nuclear weapons around the world primed to detonate, that warming trend could very quickly reverse and send us straight into a man-made ice age. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographics Show. Today we're asking, how can we survive a nuclear winter? The legendary astrophysicist Carl Sagan co-authored a paper in the 1980s called Climate and Smoke, an appraisal of nuclear winter. In this earth-shattering essay, Sagan and his partner James B. Pollock studied the physical effects a nuclear war would have on our planet and discovered that not only would such a war devastate nations, but it could potentially disrupt the global climate. By vaporizing debris and filling the atmosphere with ash, soot, and aerosols, a nuclear war would result in global dust clouds that would block the sun's rays for years, preventing the sun's energy from reaching the surface of the planet. This would trigger a cascade cooling effect, which would plummet global temperatures by as much as 22 degrees Celsius, turning sunny California into something more akin to blustery Seattle. The world would enter an artificial ice age. Though recent studies have shown that Sagan and Pollock's original estimates may have been a bit overzealous, our environment is incredibly fragile, and even a 10-degree drop in temperature would have dramatic repercussions. Not only would lower temperatures severely shorten growing seasons for crops, but all of that blocked sunlight would send weather and ocean current patterns that help keep the world mild today into disarray. The North Atlantic Drift is an ocean current that brings warm water heated by the sun and the equator to northern Europe, which in turn is why Europe is so far north yet enjoys mild weather and warm summers. With a decline in sunshine, this current will completely shut down, and without warm water being circulated around Europe and into the Mediterranean, Europe would begin to see weather close to what is common in Canada today. Spain and France's famous summertime beach destinations would be a thing of the past, and in fact, pretty much the entire Mediterranean would be far too chilly to go for a swim in. But it wouldn't be just sunny beaches that are a casualty of the nuclear winter. The North Atlantic Drift also helps bring favorable weather for growing crops to Europe, and without it, Europe would experience a catastrophic crop collapse during what little growing season may be left due to all the dust in the atmosphere. The east coast of the US is also dependent on ocean currents for its mild weather, and a global cooling that reached the equator would shut down the Gulf Stream along the US's shores. Originating in the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf Stream circulates warm water up along the east coast of the US and into southern Canada, helping bring mild temperatures to the area during spring and summer. Chilly temperatures would be hard enough to deal with, but all of that blocked sunlight would also shorten growing seasons for crops. With much reduced sunlight, humanity would be unable to grow enough crops to feed everyone alive today, and mass starvation would ensue. If current stockpiles of non-perishable goods could be evenly and fairly distributed, a doubtful circumstance in a post-apocalyptic world, it's possible that the majority of the population could survive a short-term nuclear winter. The length and severity of a nuclear winter would ultimately depend on the amount of weapons exchanged between combatants. But even a small regional exchange of just a few hundred low-yield weapons is estimated to plunge the Earth into a 10-year nuclear winter. Even with today's large stockpiles of non-perishable goods, there's simply no way the majority of the population could survive a decade of famine. Those that do survive, however, would face crippling vitamin and mineral deficiencies, leading to disease and illness, which would further decimate humanity's plunging population. In the midst of a nuclear winter, you'd probably be delighted to see a few shafts of sunlight through clouds full of choking dust. But beware, that sunlight could be lethal. That's because a nuclear war would destroy the ozone layer, meaning there would be little protection from the sun's harmful UV rays. Unless you slather up in the most powerful sunscreen you can find, basking in the sun for too long will result in severe sunburns and cancers. Your eyes would be especially sensitive to that intense UV radiation, and it would be vital to wear goggles or sunglasses with UV filters in order to keep yourself from going blind. Because UV rays can damage your eyes without you feeling it, your vision could become severely impaired without you realizing what is happening until it's too late. A nuclear winter would be clearly a nightmare scenario, but it might be survivable. After all, your ancestors already did. That's right, we're the descendant of a very small group of humans who have survived an ancient nuclear winter. 75,000 years ago, a supervolcano in modern-day Lake Toba, Sumatra, erupted with a fury equivalent to thousands of nuclear bombs and was 100 times greater than the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora, which resulted in 1816's year without a summer. Injecting 6 billion tons of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, the eruption dropped global temperatures by 3 to 5 degrees Celsius for 3 years, and further cooling lasting decades. Though scientists differ on the severity of the cooling, the Toba supereruption is widely credited with creating a genetic bottleneck in human evolution, during which the human population dropped suddenly to a surviving population of only about 3,000 to 10,000 individuals. So though a nuclear winter sounds bad, know that you are already genetically predisposed to survive one. But how exactly can you help your odds of survival? First, you'll want to tackle your greatest threat: the cold. Insulating your home will be critical to keeping warm. And if you don't know anything about insulation or construction, now is a good time to learn at least how to use spray foam insulation materials. Fuel supplies will run critically low very quickly, and even trees may become scarce if there's not enough sunlight for them to grow. You're going to want to keep out as much cold as possible while keeping in as much heat as you can at all times. Secondly, you'll want to secure a fresh water drinking supply. A nuclear winter may paradoxically not necessarily result in snow, as disrupted weather patterns and a lack of evaporation and thus precipitation may turn the world into a frozen desert. Even if there is snow where you are though, it's likely to be highly contaminated with radioactive or other particles from the trillions of tons of debris ejected into the atmosphere by the nuclear bombs. Emergency water filters will be critical for your health, as well as water purification tablets and possibly iodine pills for radiation poisoning. It goes without saying that intense radiation will also be a hazard, but you are in fact not very likely to be irradiated in a nuclear winter to stay out of ground zero blast zones. That's because a nuclear weapon is designed to air burst or explode several hundred to a few thousand meters above its target. This is because if the bomb were to explode on the ground, the blast wave would be mitigated by terrain and buildings, severely limiting the explosive potential of a nuclear bomb. High up in the air though, a blast wave can spread for several miles without being dampened by the hilly terrain or dense clusters of buildings. An airburst detonation will also ensure that the majority of the radiation from an explosion will actually be projected upwards into space, while a ground burst detonation will irradiate millions of tons of soil, which will be carried by the wind. So stay out of large craters, and you shouldn't be turning into a Fallout-style ghoul anytime soon. Your third concern will be to secure a food supply. This may be trickier than finding water or keeping warm, as even perishable goods will quickly become scarce. And with most nuclear weapons aimed at major manufacturing and distribution centers, it's unlikely you'll find much that will be safe to scavenge without irradiating yourself. Hunting and fishing may seem a viable alternative, but the world operates on a complex food web with organisms feeding on each other, and at the very bottom of that food web sits the sun. It doesn't matter if you're a polar bear or an Antarctic leopard seal. The food you eat inevitably eats food that in turn eats something that grows thanks to the sun. Polar bears, for instance, hunt seals, who in turn hunt small fish, who in turn feed on krill or plankton, which depend on the sun. Global food chains will collapse inevitably, but with a severely diminished population, you just might be able to eke out enough hunting and fishing to survive. If not, well, there's always billions of freshly barbecued human bodies lying around. A nuclear winter would decimate civilization and possibly drive humanity to the brink of extinction, but this isn't a threat we haven't faced before. As the Toba supervolcano showed us, we as a species have what it takes to survive and thrive in the face of any disaster. And with these catastrophes acting as genetic bottlenecks, our children will be even more capable of surviving whatever the future throws at them. My name is Sasha Yevchenko, and I'd like to tell you the story of how I survived one of the worst man-made disasters the world has ever seen. On April 25, 1986, I was working at the heart of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant when the number 4 nuclear reactor exploded. The blast was huge in itself, and one of my colleagues was pretty much vaporized instantly. What happened after that has become one of the world's worst real-life horror stories. but let me start from the beginning. It was evening at the plant where I worked, which was located near the town of Pripyat in northern Ukraine. The sky was a radiant blue, it was warm, and when my colleagues and I clocked in for our night shift at the plant, we were in good spirits. I remember the conversation was all about what we were going to do for the May Day holidays, and little did we know the near future would be very different from how we imagined it would be. My wife Natasha was at home with my 2-year-old. I was 24 at the time, with a new family and everything to look forward to. That night, we were told that we were going to have to run a test on reactor number 4. This didn't go down well with a lot of guys because we weren't really sure how to do it. We had no choice though. A command is a command. We argued about the right power level we should start the test at, and little did we know that there was a design flaw in the reactor. This would prove to be what you might call a fatal design flaw. What we were basically testing was a simulation of an electrical power outage. You can probably guess that such a thing, if it were to happen, would be very dangerous. But if there was an outage, the generators would kick on. The problem was this would take about a minute to gain full power. And you just don't have a minute because the water that's pumped in the reactor to keep it cool would not get pumped and too much heat would be generated. So the theory was that the electricity could be taken from the rotational energy of the steam turbine. This would in theory power the cooling pumps for that minute. So to do the test, we had to simulate this power loss and see if this theory worked. We tried this twice before, but both times the tests failed. Third time lucky is not exactly how things turned out. So we dropped the power levels. That didn't go well, and suddenly the reactor became dangerously unstable. We also ignored, and were told to ignore, some of the vital safety mechanisms. We knew something was wrong, but we were told to go ahead and keep testing. We removed something called control rods so that we could get back the power, but that didn't turn out well either. It was also against safety procedures. Those rods are like a failsafe. They prevent the reactor from generating too much power. Power then began to rise, and then rise dramatically. We weren't sure what was happening. In the reactor, steam was building up. You could say what we had then was a pressure cooker of enormous proportions. We knew then we had an emergency on our hands. We pushed the scram button, which was the emergency shutdown. We then reinserted the control rods, but they jammed. What we didn't know is that the graphite tips on those rods caused more power to surge. At 1:23 and 45 seconds a.m., the pressure cooker then blew. The 1,000-ton roof was blown right off and a fireball blasted into the sky. The air was filled with dust. Pieces of graphite were flung everywhere. Radiation spilled into the atmosphere. It was hell on Earth in the literal sense. We were all shocked in the room. The boom was so big we thought a war had happened. The walls shuddered. The whole place felt so unstable. Trust me, I'm a huge man and I'm not afraid of much, but at that point, I felt tiny, at the mercy of something terrible. I then went looking for my buddy because he must have been closest to the explosion. It was dark in the corridors, dust was everywhere. All I could hear was a hissing sound. He'd been too near the pumps. He was dead. I saw the roof had been blown off, and in the night sky I could see the stars. And then I saw something that looked quite wonderful, ethereal, like God shining down on us. It was a beam of light. That beam was something more malign than I was aware of. It was radiation, and that radiation would kill a lot of people. I then went with some colleagues to the reactor hall, but the heavy door was jammed. As I said, I'm a big man. Some people say a bear of a man. I managed to get the door open while my friends went inside the hall and tried to understand just how much damage had been caused. Those guys would all die in the coming days and weeks from radiation poisoning. At the time, we knew radiation levels were high because the device used to tell us the level, the dosimeter, was showing a needle that was off the scale. Still, at the time, all we thought was there goes our job in the nuclear energy business. We had no idea of just how catastrophic that explosion was. After about an hour, though, I knew something was wrong, and I mean wrong with me. I started to throw up, and then I got a sore throat. Outside, firefighters were already on the scene. They didn't know either about the dangerous levels of radiation, and many of those brave guys would die slow, horrible deaths. In the town nearby, people stood outside, mesmerized by this great big beam of light. Some of those people would also die from radiation poisoning. But as I said, no one really knew about the danger they were in. I had a good idea as time went on, because at about 6 a.m. I couldn't even walk. I felt deathly ill. The grim reaper of radiation was inside of me, slowly trying to relieve me of my life, my kid, my loving wife. I was taken to the hospital, and there a few of us talked about what was happening to us, just how much radiation had we been exposed to. One guy seemed to know what he was talking about, and he said if you throw up like that so quickly, well, it's a lot. We might even die. In fact, I later learned that vomiting after radiation poisoning means death for most people. I found out I'd been exposed to 4.1 sievert of radiation. You don't know what that means, of course, but let me tell you that it was about 650 times above the level that workers at a nuclear plant should get exposed, not in an hour, but in a year. It's 5,000 times more than the average person should be exposed to in a whole year. I knew I was in trouble. Some of these guys I talked to at the hospital died horribly. In a way, you could say they melted from the inside. Then, things got more surreal when the KGB came to the hospital and started to talk to me. I was then told I had to go to Moscow, and that's where they took me without even informing my wife. 128 of us made that trip, and I believe 5 people in this group died. I mean, died soon, of course. God knows who died as a result of being poisoned in the years to come. I got to Moscow, and one of the first things they did to me was shave my head. This was no time to care about appearances, and anyway, in a week, all my body hair just fell out. Most of us were having trouble breathing. Our eyes hurt, our noses hurt, everything seemed to hurt. Then we were given bone marrow transplants. I had many, in fact. What's really weird and chilling is the fact that me and a lot of guys suddenly felt a lot better. What we didn't know was with radiation poisoning at such high levels, there's kind of a rest period, a hiatus in the chaos happening inside. You think you're getting better, but then the worst stuff starts to happen. For me, a low point was pulling back my bed sheets one day and seeing my ulcerous skin dead. The worst parts of me were my shoulders, my hip, my calf. And that's because when I held that door, those parts were exposed to really high levels of radiation. Had I gone inside, well, that would have been game over for me. Parts of my body just seemed to be eaten alive. Bits of me just turned black. It was awful to see. I was turning into a monster, a kind of radioactive mutant. But I was lucky. I went through my operations and had lots of skin grafts. I wasn't dead, but when I was told I might lose my arm, I was a bit upset. They saved it, but it stayed covered in bandages for the next 7 years of my life. Even these days, I might occasionally see ulcerations on the parts of my skin that were most exposed to the radiation. One of the things that saved me was the fact that they sent me to Berlin to have microsurgery, where blood vessels were transferred from my leg to my arm. Like I said, I was lucky. I'm a fortunate man. One of those guys that worked close to me had similar surgeries. He went blind, and then within a month of his exposure, he died. What had happened to him and to the rest of us is bone marrow cells had been destroyed from the radiation, and this caused a drop in white blood cells. When that happens, you can't fight off infection, and that's when you slowly start to be eaten alive from within. I spent in total 1 year inside hospitals, and then for years after I had to regularly go back for rehab. They told me I shouldn't have another child, because the chances of that child developing leukemia were very high. Now and again I get morbid and think, when will the worst happen? But so far, my good old body has been excellent at repairing itself. My wife has stood by me, and it wasn't easy at times. People knew about what had happened to me and thought I was a walking time bomb. They'd cross the street when they saw me because they thought I'd passed the poison onto them. I was one of the monsters of Chernobyl to them, walking around with a radiation hazard sign on my back. But I'm here and I'm happy. I think I can now safely say that I survived Chernobyl. My name is Sasha Yevchenko, and that's my story.
Nuclear reactors are not pieces of equipment you come across every day. They're designed to produce thermal energy that can be used for its own sake or converted into mechanical energy, and most of the time into electrical energy. They work by maintaining a chain reaction producing a steady flow of neutrons, generated by the fission of heavy nuclei, the most common of which is uranium-235 that produces the thermal heat. There are many different types of nuclear power reactors, but you certainly can't shop for one online. However, there was one kid who was determined to get his hands on a reactor for himself. Welcome to this episode of the Infographics Show, the Boy Scout who tried to build a nuclear reactor. Imagine opening your bedroom curtains one day and looking out of your window to see a strange green glow resonating from your neighbor's shed, and then noticing government trucks being loaded with barrels marked radioactive by men dressed in hazmat suits outside your home. You might think you had been transported onto the set of the latest Hollywood sci-fi blockbuster. But in 1995, for the residents of Gulf Manor, Michigan, this was no made-for-TV drama. A young teenage boy had built a nuclear breeder reactor in his mother's potting shed, a crazy idea he thought up while working on his Atomic Energy Merit Badge in an attempt to earn Eagle Scout status. The boy's name was David Charles Hahn, who, not surprisingly, is sometimes called the Radioactive Boy Scout or the Nuclear Boy Scout. So how did teenager David Hahn go from being an everyday goofy schoolboy to nuclear reactor developer? Ken Silverstein is an American journalist who used to be the Washington editor and blogger at Harper's Magazine. He met David in the late 90s to try and figure out exactly what happened by hearing the story from the proverbial horse's mouth. He described David as oddly dispassionate, though polite, until they began to discuss his nuclear adventures. Then, for 5 hours, David became enthused as he talked about working in his backyard laboratory. He explained to Silverstein that he used coffee filters and pickle jars to handle deadly substances such as radium and nitric acid whilst working on developing his reactor. David was a shy teenager and so had only confided in a few friends about his crazy and ambitious project, but never allowed anyone to witness his experiments. He said to Silverstein, "I was very emotional as a kid, and those experiments gave me a way to get away from that. They gave me some respect." As David became more and more preoccupied with science, he had less and less time for friends, though during his high school years, he did have a girlfriend, Heather Baudet. Heather was 3 years younger than David, and she says he was sweet and caring, but not always the perfect date. Heather's mom described David this way: "He was a nice kid and always presentable, but we had to tell him not to talk to anybody. He could eat and drink, but for God's sakes, don't talk to the guests about the food's chemical composition." But how did David advance from being this somewhat geeky experimenting student to a boy with a reactor? David was a Boy Scout, and Eagle Scouts must earn 21 merit badges. 11 are mandatory, such as first aid and citizenship in the community. The final 10 are optional, and Scouts can choose from dozens of choices ranging from American business to woodwork. Of course, David chose to specialize and earn a merit badge in atomic energy. He was awarded his Atomic Energy Merit Badge on May 10, 1991, 5 months shy of his 15th birthday. To earn the badge, David visited a hospital radiology unit to learn about the medical uses of radioisotopes. He made a drawing showing how nuclear fission occurs, but most importantly, David built a model reactor using simple household apparatus, including a juice can, coat hangers, soda straws, matches, and rubber bands. The Scouts were impressed, but David had far greater ambitions. He got to work with writing as many as 20 letters a day, pretending to be a physics instructor at Chippewa Valley High School. This budding young entrepreneur approached groups in his merit badge pamphlet, such as the DOE, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or NRC, the American Nuclear Society, the Edison Electric Institute, and the Atomic Industrial Forum, the Nuclear Power Industries Trade Group. He obtained all sorts of information. The NRC was by far the most helpful, and David managed to engage the agency's Director of Isotope Production and Distribution, Donald Erb. Erb provided tips on isolating certain radioactive elements. He gave a list of isotopes that can sustain a chain reaction and imparted a piece of information that would soon prove to be vital to David's plans. Nothing produces neutrons as well as beryllium. The NRC had now given David all the information he required to build a reactor, and he just needed to source the raw materials. He typed up a shopping list of items that contained very small amounts of the 14 radioactive isotopes required for the first step. Americium-241, he discovered, could be found in smoke detectors, radium-226 in antique luminous dial clocks, uranium-238 and minute quantities of uranium-235 in a black ore called pitch blende, and thorium-232 in Coleman-style gas lanterns. David created a neutron gun and was ready to irradiate. He thought that uranium-235, which is used in atomic weapons, would provide the biggest reaction, but getting your hands on uranium is no simple task. He hunted hundreds of miles of upper Michigan looking for hot rocks with his Geiger counter, but all he could find was a quarter trunkload of pitch blende, a radioactive uranium-rich mineral, on the shores of Lake Huron. He also posed as a professor again, buying materials for a nuclear research laboratory. He obtained a few samples, but not enough. He eventually decided to switch from uranium and instead hunt down some thorium-232, which, when bombarded with neutrons, produces uranium-233. David knew from his merit badge Boy Scout pamphlet that the mantle used in commercial gas lanterns is coated with a compound containing thorium-232. He bought thousands of lantern mantles from surplus stores and, using a blowtorch, reduced them into a pile of ash so he could extract the thorium-232. Next, David needed radium. He knew radium was used in the paint on the faces of clocks, automobiles, and airplane instrument panels until the late 1960s. So he began visiting junkyards and antique stores in search of radium-coated dashboard panels or clocks. Once he had enough, David secured a sample of barium sulfate from the X-ray ward at a local hospital and used it to concentrate the radium. Now 17, he made significant progress, and David planned to build a model breeder reactor, but he needed at least 30 pounds of enriched uranium to sustain a chain reaction. He was determined to get as far as he could by trying to get his various radioisotopes to interact with one another. David said no matter what happened, there would be something changing into something, some kind of action going on there. He monitored his mini reactor at the Golf Manor laboratory with his Geiger counter. The level of radiation after a few weeks was far greater than it was at the time of assembly. I know I transformed some radioactive materials. Even though there was no critical pile, I know that some of the reactions that go on in a breeder reactor went on to a minute extent, he said. It was 2:40 a.m. on August 31st, 1994, when the Clinton Township Police responded to a call concerning a young man who had been spotted in a residential neighborhood apparently stealing tires from a car. When they caught up with David, they discovered over 50 foil-wrapped cubes of mysterious gray powder in the trunk of his car. Small discs and cylindrical metal objects, lantern mantles, mercury switches, a clock face, oars, fireworks, vacuum tubes, and assorted chemicals and acids. The police must have been baffled. They called in the Michigan State Police Bomb Squad to examine David's car and the State Department of Public Health, or DPH, to supply radiological assistance. State radiological experts found aluminum pie pans, jars of acids, Pyrex cups, milk crates, and other materials strewn about in David's makeshift shed laboratory, much of it contaminated with excessive levels of radioactive material, especially americium-241 and thorium-232. How high, you're wondering? A vegetable can, for example, registered at 50,000 counts per minute, which is about 1,000 times higher than normal levels of background radiation. After determining that no radioactive materials had leaked outside the shed, state authorities sealed it and petitioned the federal government for help. Unfortunately, David went into a serious depression after his laboratory was shut down. Years of painstaking work had been thrown in the garbage or buried deep underground. Students at Chippewa Valley had taken to calling him Radioactive Boy, and when his girlfriend Heather sent David Valentine's balloons at his high school, they were seized by the principal, who apparently feared they had been inflated with chemical gases David needed to continue his experiments. David had hoped to pursue a career as a nuclear specialist, but he ended up enlisting in the Navy. EPA scientists believe his life expectancy may have been greatly shortened by his exposure to radioactivity, particularly since he spent large amounts of time in the small enclosed shed with large amounts of radioactive material. David died on Tuesday, September 27, 2016, at the age of 39. His father confirmed that the cause of death was not from radiation exposure, but alcohol poisoning. We are exposed to radiation on a daily basis, most commonly via energy from the sun, but heavy doses can be hazardous or even fatal, particularly radiation given off from the disintegration of nuclear and atomic waste. Today we're going to be exploring places on our planet in the radioactive red zone. We're looking for the worst of the worst places to avoid. In this episode of the Infographics Show, most radioactive places on Earth. At number 10 is the Mediterranean Sea that surrounds the Italian peninsula and its islands. Its waves break the coasts of 22 countries in Africa, Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. This idyllic area has been used as a disposal site for radioactive and other toxic waste for nearly 30 years. The Italian mafia has also been accused of dumping hazardous waste into the Mediterranean, and 40 ships carrying loads of radioactive materials have gone missing since 1994. So, it's worth taking a full bodysuit if you're planning on going snookering in this area. And the Italian mafia doesn't just dump waste in their own backyard. At number 9, we have the Somali coast. During the 1980s, numerous Swiss and Italian companies secretly dumped hazardous waste along the coast. An Italian crime syndicate sank at least 30 ships loaded with waste off the shores of Somalia. The United Nations Environment Program believes that the rusting barrels of waste washed up on the Somalian coastline during the 2004 tsunami were dumped as far back as the 1990s. Birth defects and cancer are still common in the area up to this day. Number 8 is the Hanford site in Washington, USA. This place was an integral part of America's atomic bomb project and manufactured the plutonium used to produce the first nuclear bomb used at Nagasaki. During the Cold War, production ramped up and Hanford supplied the plutonium for most of America's 60,000 nuclear weapons. It has since been decommissioned, but the area is still home to a huge amount of nuclear waste and will continue to be a risk area for many years to come. At number 7 is Mayak in Russia's northeast. The industrial complex of Mayak has had a nuclear plant for decades, and in 1957 was the site of one of the world's worst nuclear accidents. At Karachi, Mayak, a poorly maintained storage tank exploded, releasing 50 to 100 tons of high-level radioactive waste. Experts believe that Karachi may be the most radioactive place in the world, and over 400,000 people have been exposed to radiation from the plant. Lake Karachi is so tainted by the nearby nuclear facilities that in 1990, just standing on the shore for an hour would give you more than enough radiation to kill you. On the plus side, lakefront property there is likely very inexpensive. At number 6 is Sellafield, located on the west coast of England. Sellafield is where, in the early 1950s, a facility produced the plutonium-239 required for the UK's first nuclear bomb. In 1957, the plant was the site of the worst nuclear accident Great Britain has ever seen. The wind-scale fire blazed for 3 days, releasing radioactive gases. It has been linked to 240 cases of cancer. The plant releases some 8 million liters of contaminated waste into the sea on a daily basis, making the Irish Sea the most radioactive sea in the world. And it is home to one of the largest inventories of untreated waste, including 140 tons of civil plutonium, the largest stockpile in the world, and enough to make hundreds of nuclear weapons. Number 5 is another site in Russia, this time Siberia, where a chemical facility is packed with nuclear waste. Sitting in uncovered pools are thousands of liters of liquid waste and 125,000 tons of solid waste. In 2000, The Guardian newspaper reported that a joint team of Russian and American radiation monitors assessed rivers in the area of a top-secret Russian nuclear weapons complex in Siberia, reaching the conclusion that contamination had reached staggering levels, the worst ever monitored, and was out of rational control. At number 4 is Mailusu, Kyrgyzstan. From 1946 to 1968, the Zapadny Mining and Chemical Combine at Mailusu produced and processed more than 10,000 tons of uranium ore, mostly to supply the USSR's nuclear weapons program with fissile material. By 2006, it was considered one of the top 10 most polluted sites on Earth, as was mentioned in that year's Blacksmith Institute report. Today, 36 waste dumps are scattered throughout the area, with just under 2 million cubic meters of unsecured radioactive mining waste. At number 3, we have the Polygon in Kazakhstan. This place was the Soviet Union's primary location for testing its nuclear weapons during the Cold War and holds the record for the largest concentration of nuclear explosions in the world. An unnerving 700,000 people live in the area, and though the impact of the radiation exposure was kept under wraps by the Soviets until the facility closed in 1991, scientists today estimate that over 200,000 people have health conditions resulting from the radiation. At number 2 is one of the world's worst and most well-remembered nuclear accidents, Chernobyl. The Chernobyl accident in 1986 was the result of a flawed reactor design. The accident released 100 times more radiation than the Nagasaki and Hiroshima bombs. It caused over 6 million people to be exposed to radiation, and estimates as to the number of deaths that will eventually occur due to the Chernobyl accident range from 4,000 to as high as 93,000. Even today, the word Chernobyl conjures up horrifying images of human suffering. And finally, at number 1 is Fukushima, Japan. Fresh in our minds, in March 2011, a massive earthquake with a magnitude of 6.9 triggered a tsunami along the east coast of Japan. The tsunami wave flooded the Fukushima nuclear plant, causing 3 nuclear meltdowns, hydrogen air explosions, and the release of radioactive material. This led to uncontrollable fires and the releases of radioactive steam and hundreds of thousands of liters of contaminated water. The effect of the Fukushima earthquake in Japan is said to be the longest-lasting nuclear danger in the world. The Fukushima disaster was the most significant nuclear incident since the Chernobyl disaster, and the second disaster to be given the Level 7 event classification of the International Nuclear Event Scale.
On the 8th of November in 2017, American Secret Service agents and their Chinese counterparts were involved in a brief altercation over the American nuclear football. While entering China's Great Hall of the People, a Chinese agent blocked President Trump's aide, tasked with carrying the football, only for Chief of Staff and retired U.S. Marine Corps General John Kelly to announce, "We're moving in," and brush past the Chinese guards. A guard grabbed Kelly, who quickly shoved the guard off, and immediately, a U.S. Secret Service agent tackled and subdued the Chinese guard. Though the scuffle was over in a flash, it highlighted the importance of this little black briefcase that must always accompany the president no matter where he goes. But just what is inside of that top-secret briefcase? Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographics Show. Today we're asking, what is the nuclear football? The head of the Chinese security detail would go on to apologize for the misunderstanding, as apparently the guards had not realized that the aide carrying the nuclear football must always be within easy reach of the US president. While some might think the American response was an overreaction, it only takes a moment to see it from the Secret Service's point of view to see why they felt the need to respond immediately and with overwhelming force. The US president had just been removed from the nuclear football while in a foreign nation, and a nation to boot who is a potential nuclear adversary. Were something to happen to the US president while he was away from the football, and China launched a preemptive first strike against the US, there would be no way for America to respond in time with its own weapons. A far-fetched scenario to some, but US Secret Service agents must constantly entertain the most extreme possibilities as potential realities every single day, for that is the only way to avert a potential and surprise catastrophe. Thus, it's a standard operating procedure that the nuclear football never be removed from the immediate physical vicinity of the US president. So just what does the nuclear football do exactly, and what's inside of it? This nuclear command and control tool is officially known as the President's Emergency Satchel and is an aluminum briefcase encased in black leather. Details are difficult to ascertain given the extreme secrecy of the device, but it is widely believed to be bulletproof and resistant to explosive damage. It weighs approximately 45 pounds and is equipped with powerful satellite communication gear to ensure the president is always in contact with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. As nuclear arsenals grew in the Soviet Union and the US, it became clear that the nation to launch first would have an immediate and possibly war-winning advantage. Such a first strike might even render the defending nation unable to launch its own nuclear counterattack, making the possibility of a nuclear first strike extremely attractive to the aggressor. With ICBMs moving at thousands of miles an hour, it became vital that the President of the United States be able to order an immediate nuclear counterattack in the case of a sudden war. Yet, after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, the President John F. Kennedy posed several questions to his staff, doubting the effectiveness of the current nuclear command system. His most pointed question, however, was, how would the person who received my instructions verify them? This one question led to a complete rethinking of how the US president was to order a nuclear attack or retaliation, and highlighted a major flaw in the system set in place for the president to do so while out of the White House. Thus, the modern iteration of the nuclear football was born. A mobile device, the nuclear football contains satellite communications gear that lets the president be in contact with the Joint Chiefs of Staff no matter where in the world he is. It also contains 4 individual items. The Black Book, as it is known, contains all retaliatory options available to the president. This can include a full-scale nuclear response against one or all of America's enemies, or a limited response which might be just a single cruise missile strike with a low-yield warhead. It's rumored that attack plans also include an option to launch a no-harm nuclear strike high above a nation in the atmosphere, delivering an electromagnetic pulse that wipes out most of a nation's electrical infrastructure. If you're a fan of conspiracy theories, it might also include a plan to nuke the reptilian aliens hiding out in the dark side of the moon. A second book contains a listing of classified presidential nuclear shelter locations, or places that the president could be taken to in case of a major nuclear emergency. These are typically hardened locations deep underground that can survive direct nuclear strikes. A manila folder with 8 or 10 pages that give a description of the procedures to initiate and use the emergency alert system, both for early warning and for post-strike communications with the nation. Lastly, a 3x5-inch card with printed authentication codes. These codes ensure to the Joint Chiefs of Staff that the person ordering a nuclear attack is indeed the US president. And while they typically stay within the football, some US presidents, such as President Reagan, actually preferred to physically carry his cards in his pocket. During the assassination attempt against Reagan when he was rushed to the hospital, not only was he physically separated from the football, but as his clothes were cut off in surgery, the nuclear codes were haphazardly discarded by medical staff and later found stuck in his shoe. But just how does the football actually work? And what process would the president have to undergo to launch a nuclear strike or retaliate against one? Firstly, only the current president of the United States is authorized to launch any form of nuclear attack, whether that's as retaliation or an escalation during the middle of a full-blown war. Should the president be incapacitated or killed, that responsibility falls to the vice president, and so on down an established chain of command. Second, the president is patched into a conference call with his top civilian and military advisors, whom all recommend a course to follow. If enemy launches are detected, this call can last as short as 30 seconds. Communications between the president, his advisors, and top military leadership are all relayed via the US's Milstar satellite network, a highly jam-resistant constellation of satellites that keeps US forces linked together around the world. As a redundancy or in the aftermath of a nuclear attack, US military forces could still use the TACAMO airborne communication system to stay in contact. Basically, a fleet of airplanes packed with communications gear that is also extremely resilient to jamming. The TACAMO communication system was designed to keep a nation ravaged by nuclear war in contact with its military forces around the world. Once an attack plan has been decided on by the president, the senior officer in the Pentagon War Room must authenticate the president's identity by issuing a challenge code using the military alphabet, such as Charlie November. The president then references his authentication codes card, known as the Biscuit, and reads the appropriate response. An emergency war order is then broadcast to all U.S. nuclear alert forces via several communications networks to ensure receipt. The order is typically about 150 characters, or the length of a Twitter message, and contains the specific war plan to execute, launch time, and authentication codes needed to unlock the missiles before firing. Seconds later, crews around the world based in missile silos, alert hangars, and submarines deep underwater all open locked safes which contain sealed authentication systems, or SAS codes, which are prepped by the National Security Agency. They compare their SAS codes with those contained within the launch order to verify the authenticity of the launch order. Any discrepancies whatsoever will result in a no-go or no-launch release of nuclear weapons. When launched from a submarine, the captain, executive officer, and 2 other senior officers authenticate the order. About 15 minutes later, the missiles are ready for launch. Land-launched ICBMs are housed in underground silos with 5 launch crews each controlling up to 50 missiles. Each launch crew is made up of 2 officers, and the individual teams are housed miles apart from each other in highly secure underground complexes to ensure their security. Each team receives their orders and compares their SAS codes with those sent by the war room. Once authenticated, the crews enter the war plan number into their launch computers, which retargets the missiles from their peacetime targets in the middle of the ocean to their wartime targets on land. At the designated launch time, the crews all turn their launch keys simultaneously, which sends 5 votes for launch to the missiles. Because the missiles need just 2 votes for launch, failure to authenticate or mutiny by 3 other crews will not stop the launch of all 50 missiles. Missiles launched from airborne platforms follow a similar method, with their individual SAS codes being verified against those sent by the war room. During the Cold War, the US and Russia both kept nuclear alert forces in the air at all times, 24/7, 365 days a year, and these crews would then immediately proceed on a vector to their assigned targets. Once SAS codes are authorized, missiles are immediately fired. Anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes after a presidential order is given, intercontinental ballistic missiles will be blasting off into the sky to rain death down on their assigned targets. And once released, there is no way to recall them, disarm them, or reprogram their trajectories. The responsibility of carrying the nuclear football is staggering, as is the responsibility of the man entrusted by the US to use it properly. While many have criticized the entire system, and one senior American general was even discharged for asking, "How do I know the president giving me the order to fire my weapons is sane?" It remains the best system for ensuring continued nuclear deterrence. Fukushima. The name alone is enough to conjure fear in the hearts of anyone living along the west coast of North America or on the eastern seaboard of Asia. To many, Fukushima is our generation's Chernobyl and a reminder of the deadly consequences of tapping into the almighty atom to fuel our modern lifestyles. Following the nuclear disaster at the Fukushima Daiichi power plant, some surveys have shown that public opinion on nuclear power is dropping in Europe, and many countries are now planning to decrease their reliance on nuclear power. In the US, the public remains almost evenly split after taking a tumble from almost 60% in favor for nuclear power pre-Fukushima. And yet, while the overall health effects of Fukushima were far less than expected, and certainly far short of every alarmist's worst predictions, the world at large remains extremely fearful of the nuclear monster. Starting construction shortly before the Fukushima disaster, though, Russia's floating nuclear power plant will be fired up this fall. Predictably, it has come under intense international opposition from groups such as Greenpeace, who fear another nuclear disaster polluting the ocean with radioactive waste. But are these fears well-founded? And is Russia flirting with a disaster that could leave its northern coasts barren of life for decades or more? Displayed boldly on its side, the academic Lomonosov sports a diagram of an atom, the international symbol for nuclear power, with a hull that's 474 feet long and a displacement of 21,500 tons. The academic is the world's only floating nuclear power plant. Nuclear power has been used at sea before. Notably, the Soviet Union created battle cruisers and icebreakers fueled by nuclear power, and the US Navy has for decades relied on nuclear power to operate its mighty aircraft carriers. Both the Russian and American Navy, as well as a few other navies, all operate nuclear-powered submarines. Yet the academic differs in that its sole purpose is to serve as a floating power plant, rather than power the ship it's installed on. The ultimate destination for the academic is the northern port of Pevek, deep in the Arctic Circle. There, power cables will be run to the vessel, and the nuclear reactor will power the port and town built around it. Though a land-based nuclear power plant already exists there, the academic will replace that facility and allow the decommission of its aging reactors. Those are not the only plans for the academic, though, as the Russians see the floating nuclear power station being sent to other port cities and industrial plants to provide much-needed electricity. Eventually, Russia plans on building a small fleet of these floating nuclear power plants and use them to power remote facilities and even offshore gas and oil platforms. With a power output of 70 megawatts, just one of these ships can provide enough electricity for 100,000 people. Yet even within Russia, there's been stiff opposition to the academic, and both foreign and even Russian cities lodged complaints over the initial route that the academic was going to take, forcing a new route and delay in its delivery. Greenpeace, meanwhile, has collected over 11,000 signatures in Russia alone, all calling for the plant to be scrapped altogether. Similar opposition in the US scrapped plans to build a floating nuclear power plant off of New Jersey shore back in the 1960s, but the Russian government has not shown any signs of shutting down the academic. So could the academic Lomonosov be a floating Chernobyl? First, the academic uses a new generation of nuclear reactors, which enjoys the benefits of vastly updated safety systems. The KLT-40 reactor on board the academic differs greatly from the reactors used in either the Fukushima Daiichi power plant or the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, which was itself a disaster caused by completely avoidable human error. In fact, the reactor used aboard the academic is similar to those used aboard Russia's nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines. And as has been shown in the past, these reactors are able to be sunk to the bottom of the sea and raised, then put back into operation safely. In fact, for a nuclear reactor to pose a serious environmental hazard, a slew of very specific catastrophes must take place in order to breach the containment vessel, and the greatest fear facing the academic, that of a tsunami sinking the ship it's housed in, simply could not lead to such a breach. The KLT-40 reactors aboard the academic have the same features of most other nuclear reactors, such as control rods, which can be lowered in an emergency in order to absorb neutrons and thus stop the nuclear chain reaction at the heart of the reactor. As a pressurized water reactor, though, the KLT-40 also features 3 additional different methods of achieving a termination of nuclear fission by flooding the reactor with cooling water impregnated with boron from 3 different sources. Compare that with the boiling water reactors at Fukushima, which were designed in the 1960s and featured only a single source and method to cool the control rods that stopped nuclear fission. But is a tsunami in the Arctic even possible? Well, given its remoteness, it's no surprise that there's very little data available on Arctic tsunamis and their frequency. What is known is that the Arctic is considered one of the most stable undersea geologic regions in the world, with very infrequent earthquakes which peak at about a magnitude of 7.5. The greatest threat of tsunamis come from undersea landslides, with scientists discovering evidence of a particularly powerful tsunami occurring 8,200 years ago, with waves estimated at 20 meters. Other tsunamis have occurred in Arctic regions, such as the 2017 Greenland tsunami, which killed 4 people. Yet this was a tsunami generated by a huge landslide across a fjord from the village it struck, and it was not generated by undersea activity such as happened in Fukushima. With no mountains across the water from the academic's planned location, there's no risk of a similar event striking the ship. Even if it did, though, tsunamis are very rarely ever dangerous to ships, and in the famous 2004 December tsunami that struck East Asia, thousands of boaters and even recreational divers a mile or 2 from the shore barely even noticed the passing tsunami. That's because the energy of the tsunami wave passed by in a column a few feet wide under the surface and was channeled into a mighty wave by the increasingly shallow coastline as it neared land. If the academic was caught in a tsunami, it would likely barely even notice the passing wave beneath its hull. In the end, nuclear power has been used at sea in far riskier applications for decades now, powering military warships all around the world. Several disasters at sea and the loss of nuclear craft have all proven the safety of nuclear power, and these were exclusively ships that were operating in extreme circumstances. The academic will be required to perform no such hardships and will instead sedately sit anchored offshore for years at a time. Fears of the academic harboring a nuclear disaster are greatly misplaced, and in fact, the use of nuclear power will help ensure that global warming coal, oil, or gas plants are not needed to power remote ports along Russia's northern coast. New developments in spent nuclear fuel recycling also promise to eliminate nearly all of the most long-lived radioactive elements, requiring safe storage of spent fuel for decades, rather than centuries or more as is currently the case. As the world faces the now uncertain effects of global warming, nuclear power promises to help fill the gaps between renewable sources, and accidents such as Fukushima should serve as a call to action to upgrade any remaining and obsolete reactors, not to ban nuclear power altogether.
Volcanoes are nature's nuclear bombs. The biggest was 10,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb blast, a terrifying reminder of what can happen when Earth blows its top. And then there are supervolcanoes that can cause eruptions of more than 600 cubic miles of magma. These are rare, with the last eruption happening at Toba in Sumatra, Indonesia 74,000 years ago. Yellowstone National Park is actually situated over a supervolcano. It has had 3 massive eruptions, the first of which occurred some 2.1 million years ago. So what if we combine this force of nature with a man-made destructive force? That's what we'll find out in this episode of the Infographics Show. What would happen if we detonated a nuke in Yellowstone volcano? In 2015, a Russian geopolitical analyst, Konstantin Sikov, who at the time was the president of the Academy of Geopolitical Problems based in Moscow, was quoted in the Russian press VPK News as saying the best way to attack the United States is to detonate a nuclear weapon and trigger a supervolcano at Yellowstone National Park or along the San Andreas Fault Line on California's coast. It sounds like a Hollywood movie-style tactic, but would it actually work? Yellowstone National Park sits right on top of a massive volcano. It's categorized as a supervolcano. But why? Well, for one, the Yellowstone caldera is a crater measuring a huge 45 miles across. If a nuclear bomb was detonated above the mouth of the volcano, then it might cause a little damage to the edges of the crater, but it's unlikely it would ignite an eruption because the blast radius of the bomb is too small to reach the pressurized chamber of magma. But the bomb would produce a fireball and incinerate everything in its near vicinity, and with all the rubble produced, it's possible that landslides would follow. Onlookers would also witness the signature mushroom cloud, and there would be a high-pressure air blast that would knock down trees and concrete buildings. If the nuclear bomb was 1 megaton in size, the blast radius would be 5,700 feet across, and the shock wave 3 miles beyond that. At 50 seconds after the explosion, when the fireball is no longer visible, the blast wave would have traveled about 12 miles at around 784 miles per hour. And anyone who survived the blast would suffer a lethal dose of thermal radiation, resulting in third-degree burns to the skin. Okay, so that's some destructive stuff. But what if a bomb was actually fired directly into the chamber? Yellowstone has 2 magma chambers. The shallower one stretches from 3 miles to about 10 miles beneath the surface and is about 55 miles long and 25 miles wide. The chamber is mostly solid, with only about 5 to 15% melt. The deeper chamber extends from 12 miles to 30 miles beneath the surface. Even though the deeper chamber is about 4.5 times larger than the shallow chamber, it contains only about 2% melt. If a nuclear bomb was somehow transported and detonated in one of these chambers, it could create enough heat to vaporize the magma and rock within the chamber, leading to an eruption. The magma is in a semi-solid, semi-liquid state, but the initial flash from the bomb would boil this quickly. Dr. Robin Andrews, a volcanologist from the University of Otago, New Zealand, explains it would heat up so quickly that it would turn into a vapor. So what you'd get is an enormous vapor cavity, like when you shake up a bottle of Coke, but it's just one massive bubble instead of loads of little bubbles. It's hard to imagine a sensible volcanologist coming up with the idea of dropping a bomb into a volcano. However, in 1992, Mount Etna erupted and its lava posed a serious threat to the nearby buildings, one of which was the Astronomical Observatory, so scientists developed a plan for diverting the flow. They first used concrete blocks to stop the flow by diverting it around the town. But because the basins to store the lava were filled too quickly, they then used explosives to make a new route for the lava. The lava eventually ended up 4.5 miles away from the small town of Zaffarana Etnia, located on the slopes of the Sicilian Giant, which was saved. We did a bit more digging and surprisingly found an example of a volcano that had been bombed. Hawaii has several shield volcanoes capable of causing serious damage to the island's inhabitants. The most dangerous is Mauna Loa, the world's largest terrestrial volcano, which has also been quite active in the 20th century. At one point, its lava flows threatened to cause destruction in the town of Hilo, leaving the population without water, as well as wiping out the surrounding tropical forests that grow on the volcano's slopes. The United States attempted to divert lava flows with explosions by dropping bombs in 1935 and 1942, but neither of these attempts were successful. Then in the 1970s, the US Air Force worked with scientists at the Hawaiian Volcano Observatory to run some test bombings. Bombs were dropped on an old inactive lava field, but the experts concluded that though bombing can destroy the top of the lava tube, it has no real effect against the deep magmatic channels. Okay, so it seems that it might be possible to trigger an eruption, but only if a nuclear bomb was somehow magically detonated inside the magma chamber, which is deep underground. If Yellowstone did erupt, it's not only the lava flow that would be a problem, the ash that spills out for hundreds of miles around is also very dangerous. It would destroy crops and lead to health problems by reducing the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere. It would even disrupt air traffic. And we already mentioned the blast wave. Well, in the case of a Yellowstone supervolcano, it would kill and injure people at a distance of up to 100 miles from the epicenter.